Good afternoon. This ought to be interesting. My name is Paul Farhi. I'm a reporter with the Washington Post, and it is my pleasure to introduce this distinguished panel. We have one of America's greatest television journalists in conversation with two of America's most formidable intellectuals, Drs. Amy Gutmann and Jonathan Moreno. They will be discussing their book, Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die. Subtitle, Bioethics and the Transformation of Healthcare in America. Let me introduce this distinguished panel. Andrea Mitchell, no introduction, everybody knows Andrea Mitchell. To compress the very extensive resume down, veteran chief foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News, also host of Andrea Mitchell Reports on MSNBC, noon, check local listings. Joined NBC in 1978 and has covered 7 presidential administrations, every presidential campaign since 1980. You've seen her on Nightly News, The Today Show, Meet the Press. She's been everywhere. Conflicts in Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo. She's been to Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, Pakistan, Israel, the Palestinian territories. The award she's won would take me all day, so I will just go to one. She just won this year the Women in Washington Journalism Lifetime Achievement Award. Andrea Mitchell. Dr. Amy Gutmann is president of the University of Pennsylvania and has been since 2004. When her current contract expires in 2022, she will be the longest-serving president in Penn's 280-year history. Now again, a massive resume, and they can get into it, but here's one stat that I really particularly like. Under her tenure at Penn, she has more than doubled the number of students from low-income, middle-income, and first-generation college students at Penn. And she's only the author of 17 books. Dr. Jonathan Moreno, philosopher, historian, bioethicist. He has written seminal works on sociology and the politics of biology and medicine. He is officially a professor of medical ethics and the history of and sociology of science at Penn. He has served on numerous presidential advisory commissions, and he has published more than 20 books, monographs, anthologies, textbooks, etc. We're honored and lucky to have this unique group with us today. Without further ado, as Lester Holt would say to Andrea Mitchell, over to you, Andrea.
Welcome all. I'm Andrea Mitchell, as you know, and I can't tell you how exciting it is for me. I feel a little overwhelmed, not just by this wonderful audience, but by the brain power next to me on the stage, and the fact that these are the questions we're all asking in our families, in our political conversation. These are some of the questions that we've heard but haven't fully been answered on the debate stage this primary season. Questions of who has the right to health care? Many of us would argue everyone has the right to health care. Who pays? How do we pay? What about the advances in science? What ethical challenges do we have as we face the issues of where science is going and where science has been? What is the role of the doctor in our society? All of these questions are addressed in this remarkable book with its country music title. So I am thrilled to be here. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. We think we should set it to music, Amy and Jonathan. But let's talk about the question that has been debated in the midterms most recently and now again in the general election. How do we address the challenge of ensuring everyone in America deciding what to do about these hugely expensive advances? You know, who gets these advances? At what stage of life do we start triaging? And how do we pay for it all? Dr. Gutmann, first to you.
Okay. Well, I wish I had a one-sentence answer, but then, of course, we wouldn't have written the book if that were the case. But I think those are exactly the right questions to ask. And the context is really an incredible moment in American history, and it's been a long moment since the 60s, where modern medicine gives us more choices than we've ever had before in human history. But with those choices come real moral dilemmas. You named some of them. We could add questions about organs, scarce organs for transplants. Who should get them if they're scarce? And we like to ask the larger question, which bioethics has sometimes neglected, which is how do you create a system in which encourages more people to be altruistic and donate their organs? So what we want to do is open up the conversation to everybody, because if you look at these issues, every one of us in our lifetime faces, almost every one of them actually. There are very few that we or our family or our friends don't face up to. And if we don't make the choices, and we have a lot of power to do that collectively as well as individually, then other people are making them for us. Big corporations, public officials, insurance companies.
At least since the 1970s, economists have said we're on an unsustainable course in terms of the amount of GDP that is spent with healthcare, and yet we're not getting enough bang for our buck. This is not a new problem, but we've kind of punted on it. So you mentioned the question of the right to healthcare. In the early 1980s, a presidential bioethics commission avoided the question. We don't think it's avoidable anymore. We believe that there is a right to a decent level of healthcare.
For everybody.
For everybody. Part of the point of the book is we can't just idealize these things. We actually have to grapple with problems ahead of us, and we have kind of not done that historically.
Yeah, and so with regard to the right to health care for everyone, the hard question is, okay, how are we going to afford it, right? What kind of a plan will actually allow us to provide affordable health care to all Americans? Let's just talk about the US. And that prompted us to write the New York Times op-ed, which advocated for revising and reinforcing the Affordable Care Act, because we are, at least our views are, we're very reluctant to take away effective health care from people who already have it, but we have to give it. We need a public option. We need Medicare for more for those people who would prefer Medicare over their own private insurance, or who are not now covered. But this is something we all have to as Americans. I think the optimistic part is healthcare is ranked now as the #1 substantive issue on voters' minds.
And when we look at costs, we know that we in America are spending more on health care and getting less. We see, political figures showing graphically, literally, that you can drive a few miles from Detroit to Windsor, Canada, and get insulin that you cannot afford. We see stories on my network and other networks of people rationing their insulin, which is so dangerous and potentially fatal.
So just so people know, I mean, you all may know this, but I think all Americans need to know this, is that we spend about twice as much as any other affluent democracy on health care per person, and we have lower life expectancy. Life expectancy has actually gone down in this country since 2015. That is totally unacceptable. And we have higher infant mortality. That's just the worst of both worlds. We have great innovation, and we can keep that innovation going, but only if we start controlling drug pricing and other medical costs.
And of course, for us, it's not just the mortality and morbidity, it's also the quality of life. So we have a chapter on public health, which somewhat neglected in our field of bioethics. Bioethics tends to be, in this country, focused on very high-tech questions, which we might get to in this conversation. We also have a section on public mental health, which has been horribly neglected. As we know, you just walk around here and you can see what's happened to our streets have become day rooms for, as the old mental institutions were. There's a sculpture, my wife and I, when we were walking over here, we'd never noticed before, a sculpture of a homeless person on a bench. So, we asked the question, is that sculpture there to recognize that there are homeless people who are often mentally ill in our midst, or is it to keep one of them from sitting on the bench? So we have some moral failures that we haven't addressed.
Speaking of moral failures, I wanted to ask you about something you wrote about in the book, which I find fascinating as we experience all of these advances today, human experimentation. And you went through the history, and I found it rather shocking. We now know about Tuskegee and other experiments decades earlier, but I found what you wrote about Henry Beecher and the 1964 paper about what happened in Brooklyn, New York, where elderly, disabled, senior citizens were being experimented upon with live cancer cells from institutions as celebrated as Memorial Sloan Kettering. And then in 1966, I believe, another expose. So talk to us a bit about human experimentation and what safeguards there are now as bioethicists.
Well, the most important single document in the history of human experiments is called, by posterity, the Nuremberg Code, which was written by the judges at the end of a trial of Nazi doctors in Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II. And our close friend passed away a few years ago, Jay Katz, who was a psychiatrist and law professor at Yale, was a refugee from Germany, a Jewish refugee. And when he was a medical student at Harvard in the late 40s, during this trial of the Nazi doctors and the decision by the judges that included as an amendment this Nuremberg Code, the famous first sentence of which, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And Jay said, the reaction of his Harvard professors was, well, that's a really good ethics code for barbarians, but we're not Nazis. And almost 20 years later, as you say, it was a Harvard professor of anesthesiology who really shook things up in an expose that included a couple of dozen cases of what he said were unethical human experiments in the published medical literature. But this is a part of the bigger story I would want to say about that we tell in the book about the change in doctor-patient relations from the late 40s to the 1960s.
That's where I was going.
And the way that patients, and we as voters, one hopes, have insisted on getting more control over the power in that relationship.
And how do patients get more control? As a patient myself, I don't know whether I'm getting the right information. You are told to get a second opinion. I'm a cancer survivor, as you know, and all of us as consumers feel a little bit intimidated by the doctor-patient relationship because of the gap in our knowledge.
Well, it's intimidating, and it's also, if you look at the economics of practicing medicine, most clinicians really wring their hands at how little time they have to actually sit down and talk with a patient. And no matter how automated, how technologically advanced medicine becomes or has become, there's no substitute for the knowledge you can get in a two-way conversation with a patient-doctor. So we went from doctor knows best, with Marcus Welby, MD, actually being played by Robert Young, a father knows best. Those of you who are laughing have to be either of a certain age or really know TV history, but I remember it well. To an ethos, so that was the culture, it was not just the practice. We have an ethos now of that the patient should be able to give informed consent and should have control over our own medical lives, but the actual practice of medicine has not caught up to the ethos. So we have, I mean, basically there are three things that we think we, in your position and my position, you and I need to do, and everybody actually, when in the doctor-patient, whenever you're planning to go to your doctor and there's something important on the line, be prepared with questions, write them down, and if it's really traumatic, potentially traumatic, come with a loved one or a friend so they can help you through it. So be prepared, be open about what your alternative treatments are, and know your goals. I mean, for some people, it's extremely important to get through a wedding in the family or a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, and not go directly into treatment, for example. And doctors are experts in medicine, but they're not experts in us. And we've really gone from an ethos of blind trust, and we tell stories about how that operated in our families when we were young, to earn trust. And it's not good to be able to make decisions all on your own. I think a patient, I shouldn't be my own doctor or my own nurse, but we should make healthcare providers earn their trust, our trust.
One of the more provocative questions that you raise in the book is what legal means are appropriate for end-of-life decisions. Dr. Moreno, do you want to speak to that?
I've said to my students the last few years, other than gay marriage, the most amazing change in the culture about these kind of value issues is the changing attitudes toward physician-assisted death. I gave a talk in Kansas City a couple of weeks ago, and I was getting ready to, once in a while I do look at my slides before I give a talk. They don't yellow the way my old lecture notes used to. And I realized I had a slide that was out of date in terms of the number of jurisdictions in the US that permit physician-assisted death. It was 7 only a couple of years ago. Now it's, if you include Montana, which has made a legal judgment about this, not a statute, it's 10. That's a really remarkable change in attitudes. And whether you approve of it or not, something is happening that we think also reflects the change in the balance in the nature of the doctor-patient relationship.
I think that's a great example of why it's important for all of us to be informed and involved, and informed in broad ways. So the question of physician-assisted death is so controversial that we don't even agree on what to call it. The opponents tend to call it physician-assisted suicide. But whatever you call it, a very small number of people, even in the states where it's legalized, use it. Whereas a huge, millions of people use hospice care, and many more millions would if only it were known, accessible, and affordable. It's very important that we understand that the things that are most controversial aren't necessarily the most important things, even though we need to discuss them. And being a theorist of deliberative democracy, I think it's really important that we debate these things. But this culture is shifting as physician-assisted death shows at the it's the tip of the iceberg, right, of how much patients have been taking healthcare into our own hands, but not exclusively our own hands.
And 2.5 years ago, my mother died in a nursing home in Rockville. We had hospice, Montgomery County Hospice. They were terrific. Anybody who's worried that this can get out of hand in terms of moving too far, bending the needle too far, I can tell you it is a highly scrutinized process. They're being watched very carefully in terms of how much medication they give for palliative purposes. So the way that this was derided a few years ago as death panels and so forth is really not helpful. And it's again another way that we have kind of as a political culture avoided getting our arms around the issues.
Well, I don't know if I saw Zeke Emanuel before, but he's written extensively on this. It's been totally distorted, but it's been really by people who want to make it just a crass political issue. But in fact, and we talk about this in the book, there is broad agreement on end-of-life care, but not a recognition of people's right to end their lives in a way that they have some control over the pain and the suffering and the dignity of how they perceive it.
And there's also palliative care at home, where there are hospital visits and doctors and visiting nurse visits and decisions that are made with informed consent over not being brought into the hospital in an emergency.
If you have the wherewithal to access those services. And we were fortunate that we were able to in my mother's case. But it's a system that you have to be able to figure out, have to have the time and the energy to address.
Which is why it's so important to face up to these kinds of issues before there's an urgent situation and you really don't have the time. This is a time when I think the American public's putting healthcare at the top of their issues of concern should spread far beyond the politics of it to how we inform ourselves in our daily lives, both for ourselves and our families.
Now, you alluded to your New York Times op-ed, which was great and talked about Medicare for more. Just to define our terms, how do you envision Medicare for more adding on to the Affordable Care Act? Because the debate, of course, is gradations of Medicare for all and other options.
You know, I think when we started to write the book, Amy, we didn't really think about the election cycle. You know, now we find ourselves in the thick of it, and the book, you know, so relevant in that respect. Although there are a lot of other issues than that in the book. What we're most concerned about is, first of all, making sure that people who are running for office and the incumbent are very clear about what they're going to do, and that we not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We think there have been some important advances as a result of the Affordable Care Act. There's a way to go, but millions of more people are covered now. There are problems. There's some junk insurance that some states are allowing people to buy that doesn't really cover them when they really need something. There are problems with deductibles. There are problems with co-payments. We would like to see the candidates be very specific about how they're going to address those details in what they propose to do.
So we have our own views in the book, but ultimately we want to make sure that everybody has basic health care coverage. It is a right, not a privilege, that if you suffer from insulin-dependent diabetes, you should have access to affordable insulin. And in this country, that isn't true right now. It's just not true. The same thing is true for asthma patients. I mean, the idea that asthma inhalers now are scarce commodities because some people can't afford them is unacceptable. So, but what that means is any program that builds on the Affordable Care Act and enables everybody in this country to have basic health care at affordable rates is something that we would defend. And I believe from everything we've seen in the polls, a vast majority of Americans would defend it. So with regard to the candidates, we should hold their feet to the fire. Yeah. And for those who want to we know that the repeal and replace movement had no replacement. And now with the Democratic candidates, we ought to ask ourselves and them, okay, if you're going to scrap the ACA, how are you going to enable any fraction of the 160 million Americans who have private employer health care coverage who want to keep it? How are you going to be sure that they have as effective health care coverage? And for the ones who want to leave their employer coverage, because there's some employer coverage that isn't effective, there should be a public option for them. It should be for all of them. And we also think that Medicare should be authorized to negotiate drug price controls. They are the largest payer of prices of drugs and treatments. And we are the only advanced society that doesn't allow a government payer to actually look at the effectiveness of different drugs and judge how much is worth paying for them.
It's really some kind of insanity that we don't do that.
It is really. So let me give you an example of why we think the title is appropriate to so many things we're facing in healthcare, all of us are facing. So our university is the home, as several other universities are, of great discoveries in immunotherapy, and they are saving lives. Perhaps the most famous case is that of a former 7-year-old, a girl who is now 14 years old. She was 7 years old on her deathbed. Her name is Emily Whitehead. Tom and Carrie Whitehead, her parents, searched. All traditional treatments didn't work. They searched for an experimental treatment. They found one at the University of Pennsylvania and at Children's Hospital. Carl June had discovered this treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Emily is now a cancer-free 14-year-old, and she's become a spokesperson with her parents for access to this treatment. Now, this treatment now can save the lives of children as well as adults. It's saved the lives now of hundreds, maybe thousands, but it's very expensive. Yet, it is by every measure cost-effective. It saves lives. And there are other things that are very expensive that don't save lives, that there are many treatments that we get that we'd be better off without.
So we believe in access to health care for all. We believe in really improving our public health system. And we think, and this is what Amy was addressing, basic science needs to be pushed forward. We need to work on basic medical science. The NIH and the NSF have been constantly under threat for the last few years. It's a terrible mistake. A good example that I'm particularly interested in is sickle cell. So sickle cell, first of all, many sickle cell patients are not getting adequate care that is theoretically available now that they should be able to get, particularly after the pediatric period. That transition is really tough for sickle cell patients. And in many cases, they're really unable to function because of their crises. So we're not doing that well. We also, though, have really some great opportunities in terms of CRISPR, the acronym everybody knows now. There are more than a dozen clinical trials for sickle cell. It could be curative. So we have to be able, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to do both. But it does require society taking a serious look at our needs, both in terms of access to healthcare and public health on the one hand, and pushing forward the medical science on the other. That can be a game changer for so many people, and it can be tremendously cost effective if it works.
How do we deal, as bioethicists, how do you deal with the situation on reproductive health in the public health sector where religious restrictions have changed the way the State Department, for instance, deals with population issues through the United Nations, as well as the gag order, which is now being litigated from the Ninth Circuit decision? And these are tough questions, but how do we as a society deal with that when...
So we talk about stem cell research. That I think it's a great example of something that was once incredibly divisive.
Right.
And there's now large, not entire, but large bipartisan support developed for stem cell research. Why? Because people like Nancy Reagan and others had people in their family who could benefit from the consequences of developing this kind of medical care. So things that were once really controversial, when both prominent people and, most importantly, the American public recognizes and gets engaged and really pushes to have it move forward, that's when we really see progress. Most of us are easily forget, and some of you weren't even born then, but for those of us who were alive when Medicare was passed, all the same arguments. It was a communist plot, it was socialism. The same thing with fluoridation. We talk about fluoridation in a town near where we both grew up, in Newburgh, New York. My hometown, which was quite a conservative town, I heard that it was a communist plot to fluoridate our water. Well, guess what? Children's caries now have been, are so much less than they were before. A dentist in Newburgh said that when he saw a child with a mouthful of cavities, he knew that child didn't grow up in Newburgh, New York. And it took 8 years before New York City, with a coalition of the most famous pediatrician, Spock, and Dr. Spock, right?
Yeah.
The first Dr. Spock.
Yeah. Not Mr. Spock.
Jackie Robinson, Eleanor Roosevelt. It took 8 years before Robert Wagner, who was known to be a very cautious New York mayor, he passed fluoridation. So while there are some issues that produce these horrible deadlocks, and almost every issue produces them in Washington now, if we get engaged, we can change that. And only if we get engaged will that change. And the fruits of modern medicine are worth our struggling for them. At affordable rates.
And there are often unanticipated good consequences of letting the science move forward. So in the case of embryonic stem cells, that led to the use of what people sometimes call skin cells that have been made pluripotent in the laboratory, quite similar to embryonic stem cells. That helped also to calm the debate. In the case of water fluoridation, people didn't realize how important healthy gums are to health 40, 50 years ago. And that has been proven out over the years.
With some of the technological advances, AI and everything else that's happening, what are the big issues that you see to each of you? And then we'll love to bring in the audience for questions. The biggest issues that are new challenges that you as a philosopher have to think through.
I'm obsessed at the moment with what are, and this is a very wonky term, but I'll use it, what scientists call cerebral organoids. So these are little bits of cerebral organoids, little bits of brain tissue that in the laboratory can be cultured, and they grow into lentil-sized structures that recapitulate some of the ways that our brain cells talk to each other. That is an incredible model for example, for some of the mental illnesses for which the well is dry. We don't have really good, significant improved therapies for people with schizophrenia, for example. That is terrifically promising. So that's very exciting. Some people will find it creepy, but there are some problems that neuroscientists cannot address.
You should say about the mouse with the ear.
Well, so about 15 years...
Just to give you an example of creepy,
it's a good point.
Creepy good, actually?
Well, 15 or 16 years ago, when a colleague at Stanford proposed to put human cells and brain cells in mice, and then there was a kind of, for purposes of trying to find solutions to some terrible diseases, and then there was a picture that went on the internet of an actual photograph of a laboratory rodent with a human ear growing on its back, and people were creeped out. Why was that being done?
Yeah.
Well, understandably, but that was being done because children in accidents who lose their ears could have a transplant if this were to be successful in such a way that their immune system wouldn't reject it. So let's try to understand what's going on here. We need to kind of catch our breath on some of these things. I'm a big science fiction fan. Ask anybody in my family. I'm totally obsessed with science fiction. Sometimes it can be very eye-opening to think about some of the imaginative ideas that science fiction writers have. I love that stuff. At the same time, it's science is not science fiction. Science is only, in the case of the stuff we talk about in the book, it's also about improving the quality of human life.
So this is why we wrote the book together. He's a science fiction fan, and I like Italian neo-realist films, right? I like to be very pragmatic. So my answer to your question are two things that I think are very different, the future, in my, realistic hope for the future. One is that we get cost controls that are reasonable so that the great new technologies like immunotherapy like the new brain science discoveries can move forward, because only if good science partners with good ethics does it move forward. There are critics of bioethics who think it's putting the brakes on science. That is precisely wrong. What good ethics does is enable science to surge forward, because the moment something like Tuskegee or the Brooklyn Hospital, I was born in Brooklyn, so I really identify with it, happens, big brakes are put on, and it happened with gene therapy at the University of Pennsylvania with Jesse Gelsinger. The brakes were put on for a decade. So that's one thing that I'd love to see surge forward. The other thing, which we focus on in the book very early on, is we are experiencing something like the tragedy of the commons with regard to public health and mental health in our country. We need to invest more in public health and in mental health. And when we do, because we will do it, the smallpox vaccine saved over 50 million people's lives. China put a public health initiative in for the largest cause of mental illness, which is iodine deficiency disorder, and saved tens of millions of lives. The tobacco control programs that we put in more recently, over 6 years, have saved an estimated 22 million people's lives. So the context, we talk about nudging people to do the right thing. I think whether we like it or not, we're being nudged. I am still furious over the fact that every time I went to the supermarket with my child, when you check out, you have to check out and pay. All the sugar-loaded candies were there, which, by the way, appealed not just to her, but to me, because that was the environment I grew up in. Now you don't have to go to the supermarket, I suppose, but it's not only in supermarkets, it's all the stores. So we're being nudged. The question is, I call that nudging rather than nudging, the bad kind. It's a cultural thing. But we want to be, right, we want to be nudged in the right directions.
With that, I just could listen to you two forever, but let's bring some of our audience in. There are microphones set up, and please get in line. And yes, ma'am.
Tricky two-part question, one for each. The first relates to 80% of Medicare is spent in the last year of life. Okay, when Reagan was shot, I can say now, it's not a HIPAA violation, I was a nurse for James Brady. I also was a nurse for many people with congestive heart failure, chronic renal failure, on respirators. And I tried to have the families say, enough, enough. And then I was lucky enough to work at the White House for Reagan on health policy. And I made the mistake as a summer intern of saying, only Barbara Bush can have this discussion with our nation. And look what happened last year. Mrs. Bush made a decision, enough is enough. I've had enough medical care. And until this nation has an honest discussion that 80% of Medicare is spent in the last year of life, we have to say no to something. Second question is mental health. I just moved back here from Philadelphia. We stole Vincent Price from you, to Duke. But anyway, you do a great job in Philly. Dr. Gutmann, I have the highest respect for you. But Penn does have one of the highest rates of suicide. So in Britain, they have Heads Together, an initiative with the royal family, because they noticed all their charities that their mother started, veterans issues. So the mental health question for Dr. Gutmann, the 80%.
You want to start?
Thank you both for both questions. Those are tough questions.
There was a part of this is the way that end-of-life care is understood by people, and the media have something to do with that. I love the media. Nonetheless, the way that people have come to understand through film and television what it is like to be on a ventilator indefinitely, and how many people actually get out of the ICU having had a heart attack and so forth. There was a really great paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine about 20 plus years ago by a Harvard medical student, took a year off to work for a TV doctor show. And he wrote a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine in which he compared the rate of successful departures from the hospital on television, for somebody who's had an MI, a heart attack in the ICU, as compared to the real world. The epidemiology of myocardial infarction and TV doctor shows was the title. It was way over 80%. By the end of the hour, you're doing great. Well, that's not always true. So I think it does take the culture a little while to catch up with the technology.
Yeah.
And I think we are doing that right now, and your illustration, the story of
Yep.
Mrs. Bush, is a fantastic illustration of that.
So on mental health, we had at Penn a year where we had a series of really tragic suicides. And in the context of a society in which there is a mental health epidemic, I know that term is used too often, but it truly, if you look at the rates of mental health problems, serious mental health problems, and the increased rates of suicide, they've been terribly troubling over the years. So what we did was we got a group of students, faculty, experts in mental health at our hospitals, really terrific people, to do a 360. And we now we're the only Ivy Plus institution that has a chief wellness officer for the whole, and we've totally reorganized our counseling and psychological services. We have posted on our website, Wellness at Penn, with all the resources, and we really took ownership of the issue, much as we advise in the book we have to do. And it was amazing to me that last year, for example, when I met with the student groups who really care a lot about this, and I asked them, so after I asked them direct questions, I said, just tell me what you're feeling about Penn. They said there's been a sea change from their freshman year to the senior year because they really feel the institution cares about their mental as well as physical health and well-being. So I think that's what we have to do, and we also have to, as citizens, try to find ways of making sure our public officials put the funding into mental health. It ought not to be stigmatized. The estimates are 1/4 of our population has mental health issues, and these are illnesses like any other that we should own, and we should feel that people have a right to care.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
So, medical care is expensive, and there in a national healthcare system, there will be limits to what that system can afford. In other countries, the government set limits as to what patients will get at certain points in their life. In this country, it seems like the legislators and policymakers are developing a system where they put that decision on the provider, thus straining the provider-patient relationship, instead of saying something like, if you're 80 years old and you are in kidney failure, you can't get dialysis anymore. So what do you think about those policies, and do you think the government needs to step up its side of making decisions in terms of health care?
So that the choice, there are other choices between, not just those two choices. In other words, think about it. We have to wrap our minds. We spend twice as much per capita as any other advanced society. I mean, these are very innovative societies. These societies don't have, Germany and Switzerland don't have single payer systems. And we can actually, we're paying up, we're coming close to 20% of the GDP. We're at between 18 and 19%, and it's just going up. So there are ways to enable people who need care, need end-of-life care as well, to get it and rein in the prices of treatments and drugs. So you don't have to say when you're 80 years old you can't get this. There are many people, I mean, I have friends now who are 90 going on 100, and they're incredibly well functioning. And we write about, in the epilogue to the book, about a dear friend of mine who's about to turn 90, who's the survivor not only of the Holocaust, but of 3 different cancers, and was on a very, very expensive drug, among others, Herceptin, which is a kind of miracle drug. We don't have to, the alternative to what we're doing now, which is unaffordable and unacceptable, it's inequitable, is not to tell people after a certain age you don't get a treatment. There are other ways of doing this.
And there are.
And other societies have done it. Not, I mean, our politicians like to use the National Health Service and the austerities that they're going through as the negative example. There are many positive things to say about it and some negative things to say about it. But they don't like to point to Germany, for example, which has very low infant mortality, very high life expectancy, and half the cost per capita, and very high innovation.
We also have a default in our system to gadgets, to technology. So I often like to tell young doctors in training, it's not that you're stopping the caring, you might be withdrawing some treatment, but you continue to care. And that is often what people want near the end of life. They don't necessarily, it's not that we have to translate every gadget into some form of care. The care is a human factor, not a technological factor.
I think we have time for one more quick question and quick answer, and then we have to wrap up.
Comparing U.S. healthcare outcomes with those of other developed countries in relation to cost, aren't there societal factors such as gun violence, poverty, and racism that lead into healthcare costs and poor outcomes that are not included in the other countries' statistics? How can we improve healthcare outcomes and lower costs without addressing these societal issues?
That's a great question.
Right, we can't, we cannot.
We can't.
And that's precisely why an early chapter in our book is all about public health, because two big things about healthcare. One is that the underinvestment in public health hurts disproportionately lower income and middle income and minorities in this country. We're talking clean water, the availability of infrastructure, that lead-free paint. Think about what's going on in New York City right now. So public health is incredibly important. The other fact about healthcare is, as we have runaway costs of healthcare, the single biggest problem that creates outside of healthcare is it starves public education at the state level. Because states have had their budgets being drained away into unaffordable healthcare away from public education. And that, of course, also hurts just those people that you spoke about. And that is another difference between our society and Germany, for example.
Poverty is a huge risk factor for poor health.
Yeah.
And so is inequality. It turns out that there's some really interesting neuroscience that shows that if you live in an inequitable society, that you tend to be more stressed and depressed. Inequality is a source of mental illness, whether you are poor or not.
And then we think about nutrition, we think about all the other issues, and the environment, climate change, and aside from lead, most obviously, but Newark, New Jersey right now, but what is going on in terms of pollution?
Climate is a huge and enormous factor in the future of public health.
But there is a way forward, and I think it's really important for us to recognize these problems and then realize that all the progress that has been made would not have been made had the American public not mobilized. We can't depend on the public officials for doing any number of the things that we need to be done unless we really hold their feet to the fire, take ownership of it ourselves.
Well, we've only scratched the surface, but I just want to say that this book it's philosophy, it's obviously ethics, it's science, it's narrative, it is just a wonderful book. And it should be a primer, I think, for all of us in an election cycle and in life. So I just want to thank you. I'm so grateful.
Thank
so
you, Andrea.
privileged
Thank
to
you.
be here.
Thank you.
Amy Gutmann, Jonathan Moreno.
Thank you.
Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.